About 1 person in 100 suffers from schizophrenia, the most debilitating of all psychological disorders. Schizophrenia affects males and females equally, and it occurs in all countries and in all ethnic groups. It is usually first diagnosed in young adults in their teens or early 20s. However, family members typically describe the patient as having been different, unusual, or having had a mild thought disorder at an early age. Long-term institutionalization with occasional home visits is required for about 1/4 of the afflicted individuals.
Okay, so that's the problem, isn't it? That's the complaint, right? Well, I have kryptonite in me. You know what that is, don't you? Kryptonite? And, so if I have kryptonite in me and I drink coffee and soda, and no one else knows what to eat, I mean, you live on raw eggs? Do you live on raw eggs? Do you eat raw eggs? When I was pregnant, I think boys get pregnant and girls don't. Yeah, it's true. But I ate raw eggs, but, do you eat raw eggs?
When it comes time to take her back to the hospital, she's, reluctant to go back. And then I say to myself, is it possible? Is it possible that I could keep her home?
Parnock shopping.
And then
You want to go Parnock shopping? You want to go Parnock shopping?
Heather, we're going to have to go back. You know that.
I know.
Well, we don't have to go back right away.
But you're not rough with me. Wait till they come here with the straight jackets, okay?
No, Heather, they're not going to do that.
If they don't do that, they don't have to go back. Mrs. Deloche and Mrs. Bond told me in the morning that I am not welcome back. She said, we ain't coming after you. They said that.
Well, they shouldn't come after you. We're not going to have them come.
I do nothing, and that's what I want to do, nothing.
I know.
To bear a child who is that different is a tremendous load for a family to carry. To learn from the psychiatrist that this difference, this awful difference, may very well have been due to the way the child was nurtured, a disease of nurture, if you will, is quite an awful thing to carry. It generates an awful lot of guilt in loving parents.
It's interesting how the feelings about this disease have changed over the last century. When schizophrenia as a concept was first developed about 100 years ago, most of the investigators and physicians felt that it was a brain disease and were quite certain of it. No one could ever determine what that disease was made up of, and the research, such as it was at that time, was quite confusing. About 50 or 60 years ago, with the coming of psychoanalysis and the ideas about the power of the environment, it became an article of faith that schizophrenia was a disease due to the environment, and more specifically to the family orientation, the family interactions for the young person. I was taught this when I was in medical school, and in the few years that followed that, this is the basis on which we try to treat patients. And it was a very terrible time because we had no specific treatments, and the parents had to carry an enormous load of guilt, the possibility that they had made their child schizophrenic. As a matter of fact, a term that was in common use then was the schizophrenogenic mother, the mother who generates schizophrenia in her own youngster. And you know, parents have enough to be guilty about as they work to produce fine young people. To think that they had produced this devastating disease was a terrible load to carry.
At the turn of the century, every neuroscientist that was interested in schizophrenia was convinced that this was a brain disorder. There was no skepticism about that. It was only as that sort of stagnated and people really couldn't make much of the findings that they had at the turn of the century that people began to raise this notion of psychogenesis, that somehow either bad mothering caused schizophrenia, or that bad neighborhoods caused schizophrenia, or drugs, or some peculiar school experience, or some major psychic trauma of some kind caused schizophrenia, for which there's absolutely no scientific evidence whatsoever to this day.
In the last 30, 35 years, it's become increasingly clear that schizophrenia, the group of schizophrenias, are indeed organic diseases, and that one aspect of the schizophrenic reactions are genetically induced. The whole disease is unquestionably not a genetic phenomenon, because if you have identical twins, one of whom is schizophrenic, the other has only a 50% chance of being schizophrenic. So clearly, other factors are involved. We know that if there is a schizophrenic reaction somewhere in the family, sibling, parent, or even grandparent, then the young person has about a 10 to 12% chance of having the disease. And if there is no discernible disease in the family, then the incidence is about 1 or 1.5%. So quite clearly, it's a kind of final common denominator disease in which a number of factors, genetic, organic, developmental, and perhaps to some extent environmental, are all involved.
Dr. Scheibel and his colleagues have been studying the neurological basis of schizophrenia, focusing on the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. The hippocampus is located in the temporal lobe region, deep within the brain. It plays an important role in memory, emotions, and moment-to-moment evaluations of real-world experiences.
With the coming of the major tranquilizing drugs, the neuroleptics, it became increasingly likely that there was a very strong chemical, molecular problem at the base of some schizophrenias. And that, of course, also pointed toward organic disease. We started to work in the area in the middle 1970s. And after doing work with a part of the brain known as the hippocampus at the base of the temporal lobes, we found that there are some very clear-cut organic pathological changes, changes in the orientation or organization of the nerve cells. In most of us, you and me, the nerve cells are lined up very nicely like slats in a picket fence. In many schizophrenics, not in all of them, they're every which way, like a fence that's fallen apart. As a matter of fact, I have here some illustrations which show quite clearly what the normal looks like as compared to the abnormal. We show the two patterns that we found in normal hippocampus and in the hippocampus of the schizophrenic patient. These are just two different methods of visualizing or staining the cells. Here we have normal cells. The cells are lined up very nicely, and their processes, which are called dendrites, are very, very nicely organized like slats in a picket fence. Here, the cells are all awry. They point in every which direction, and as a result, they're extensions. These dendrites also point in every which way. This must do rather drastic things to the connections. And since, again, it is the hippocampus which helps us, in a sense, appreciate and digest moment-to-moment reality, we can sort of infer that this must do some pretty remarkable things to the way the individual sees the world.
During the second trimester of fetal development, the brain produces new brain cells at the rate of 100,000 every second. It is suspected that some forms of flu virus could disrupt the migration of cells to their proper destination in the formation of the cortex.
One of the things that these cells have to do is to eventually leave the place, the central place along the neural tube where they're generated, and they have to migrate out into their final location in the cortex or cerebellum or what have you. This migration is a very critical thing, and it occurs primarily during the second trimester of pregnancy. All right, this drawing shows what we think is happening in the normal developmental process and the schizophrenic process. In normal development, after the millions and billions of cells finish their dividing, their mitosis down here, they have to migrate into their final position in the nervous system. They migrate up these guide cells that are almost like rope ladders, and they come to the point where they have to get off the guide cell and make actual layers. This is what makes the layers that characterize our brain, especially our cerebral cortex. In the case of the schizophrenic, it appears as though the molecules, the chemicals that hold the cell to the guide wire here, don't relax their grip when the cell comes to the right position. As a result, they begin to pile up and make these unusual lumps. The cells then get disoriented and go all awry. We think that this then may be the mechanism for the unusual pathology that we found in the hippocampus. It points again to the importance of the second trimester in pregnancy, which is when almost all of this migration would normally occur, and in this case abnormally occurs. And we believe that this is due, as I say, to changes in the molecules that make these stick, and those changes in part can be related in part to mother having the flu during that period. It turns out that the flu virus is one of a very small number of viruses that have a special enzyme in the capsule of the virus. It's known as a neuraminidase. And the neuraminidase specifically, among the other things it does, specifically affects the adhesiveness or stickiness of these molecules that allow this to happen. And so it's very possible that these nerve cell adhesion molecules are somehow disturbed by the flu virus, and there may be other factors that disturb it too, and this eventually leads to this clumping and abnormal positioning of cells. And we think that there is a causal relationship between abnormal cellular position and the way the individual experiences the world, which of course then may lead to a schizophrenic process. We've spoken primarily about the hippocampus, but that by no means limits the range of brain areas that are involved. There's strong evidence that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that essentially makes the executive decisions, helps us think about the future, that this is very much involved. As a matter of fact, many schizophrenics, when they're challenged to use this part of the brain in certain tests, this part is found by PET scans to be less vascularized and less active, so it definitely is not working right. Near the hippocampus and the temporal lobe, other parts of the temporal lobe turn out to have fewer cells or a different distribution of cells. And even the ventricles, these fluid carriers that are deep in the hemisphere, in most, not all, but in most schizophrenics, they're enlarged. So there is a kind of both diffuse and focal pathology in so many parts of the brain.
But we do have to go back so that you can come here again and stay longer and stay overnight. You know that, Heather. We're going to have to leave, and then you'll come home again, Heather.
I'm not going to Washington.
We're just waiting for the paperwork.
Did you ever have a complex? A president of the United States complex? I mean, you're retarded. You know, I'm retarded. You don't realize, didn't you?
We are now beginning to understand the multiplicity of factors which lead to schizophrenia. It is clear that schizophrenia should be thought of as a neurological disorder with emotional and cognitive symptoms. As such, the symptoms of schizophrenia may be relieved by medication, which attempts to normalize brain chemistry. Environmental factors may also play a role in the onset of symptoms. In combination with medications, environmental factors can influence the ability of the schizophrenic to function independently.